My Brother Sam is Dead, Chapter 10. Having father gone was strange. The tavern seemed cold and empty, the way it is when you wake up at night and realize that the fires have gone out. Mother didn't cry, except right at the beginning, the night I told her what had happened. She went on believing that he was alive. They have no reason to kill him, Timothy. I believe they're holding him somewhere. They'll let him go by and by. But days passed and he didn't come home, and soon she changed her story. He's in a prison ship somewhere, she said. As soon as this terrible war is over, he will come home again. I didn't know whether she was saying what she believed or was just trying to keep me from thinking that father was dead. Now half the family was gone and our lives had really changed. Mother and I had all the work to do, which meant that there was hardly any time off for either of us. We even had to work on Sundays, which was a sin. God will forgive us, Tim, Mother said. Don't worry about it. I'm sure of that. I didn't tell her that I wasn't worried. But work worried me, all right. There was so much to do. Old Prue, and the chickens and the sheep to take care of, and the spring, planting the corn and greens we needed for the tavern, and the cleaning and the cooking, and of course somebody had to be at the tap all the time to draw beer and serve the meals to travelers and make beds for people who came through needing a place to sleep. There were a lot of people going through, too, messengers going here and there, and people moving to different towns, and commissary officers and such. So business seemed good, but actually it wasn't, because a lot of people, the ones on official business, paid in commissary notes, which were just a piece of paper that wouldn't be worth anything at all unless the rebels won. You couldn't buy very much with a commissary note. A lot of people wouldn't take them unless they were strong patriots and felt they ought to in order to show their faith to George Washington and the rebel government. Business was good in the store too. Food was in short supply, and so was everything else, and we could sell anything we could get our hands on: cloth, farming tools, wheat, sugar, rum, anything at all. We even started dealing in used goods. Farmers were desperate for everything: shovels, plowshares, candle molds, churns, and all the rest of it. Sometimes Mother would hear of a widow whose husband had died or been killed in the war and couldn't manage the farm anymore. She'd be willing to sell us the old farming tools, and we could easily resell them at a good price. But even that didn't help much. Prices were going up, 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 and depreciation of the paper money took a lot of the profit out of it. You'd sell a bag of nails for a shilling, and when you went to buy some more, you'd find that the price had gone up to 2 shillings, so you came out behind. We'd raise the price of nails, and then, by the time we were able to get a hold of any more, the price would have gone up again, and we'd still be behind. Of course, you weren't supposed to raise the prices. The Connecticut General Assembly had made laws about how much you could charge for things, but the laws weren't any use. If you had to pay 2 shillings for nails, you couldn't sell them for 2 shillings, no matter what the law said. What we did was get around the law by charging the legal 2 shillings for nails, or whatever it was, and then charging a shilling for the bag we sold them in. It wasn't really honest, but we had no choice. The whole thing really made me feel pretty sick, working that hard from sunrise to sunset and never being able to get ahead. But there was nothing we could do about it except pray every night for the war to end soon, and that Father and Sam would come home again. We spent a lot of time trying to get the letters to Sam. Mother figured that once Sam realized that his own side had captured or maybe even killed his father, he'd come home and help manage things. He should be tired of playing soldier boy by now, Mother said. I should think that the glory would have worn off. She had a talk with Colonel Reed about it. Colonel Reed had been head of the whole regiment of the militia, but he had quit the job. He had said that because he was too old, but everyone knew it was just an excuse. He quit because he was against the war and didn't want to fight in it. He was a patriot, but he didn't approve of the war. He said to my mother, Miss Meeker, even if you can persuade him to come home, they may not let him. That doesn't seem right. Of course Sam would claim it was a hardship case, the father gone and only the younger brother left at home. But the fact that Mr. Meeker is considered a Tory won't help. Mother said, if he's got the brains he was born with, he won't tell them that, will he, Colonel Reed? Colonel Reed smiled. I don't imagine that he will, Miss Meeker. But I wasn't so sure anybody was going to be able to change Sam's mind to begin with. He'd gotten himself set to win the war and throw the British out of the country so we could be free, and when Sam was determined, he usually stuck to things. Pig-headed was what some people called him, but not me. Of course, I still hadn't figured out what he was fighting for. It seemed to me that we'd been free all along. What had the English government ever done against me? I thought about it a lot, and I could never find any way they hurt me that mattered very much. Naturally, the church, we had to pray for the king and the parliament, and that was a nuisance because it made the prayers go on longer. As a matter of fact, we weren't supposed to pray for the king and the parliament anymore. The assembly had declared that it was treason to pray to them. But Mr. Beach was pretty brave, even though he was over 75 years old, and he went on praying for them anyway. A couple of times the rebels had come into the church and pulled him down in front of the pulpit and pushed him around, but he didn't care. He made us pray for the king and the parliament just the same. Still, besides having extra prayers, I couldn't think of anything the king had me do that I didn't want to. But that wasn't the way Sam felt about it, and I wasn't exactly sure why he'd come home even when he'd found out that Father was gone. There was only one way to find out, so we kept trying to get the message to him. We asked Betsy Reed to tell him about Father if she got in touch with him, but she didn't know where he was any more than we did. So there were a lot of changes in our lives, but the biggest one was the one happening inside myself. Ever since I had gotten the wagon home myself, I hadn't felt like a boy anymore. You don't think that things really happen overnight, but this one did. Of course, I was dead tired when I went to bed at night, and Mother let me sleep in late in the morning. And when I woke up, I was different. I noticed it at first at breakfast. Usually I sat down over my porridge, moaning to myself about the chores I had to do and having to go to school or something, and trying to think of some way to get out of whatever it was. Or when my mother turned her head, I'd scoop up a fingerful of molasses from the jar and stir it into my milk, or I'd eat breakfast slowly so I could stall going to work. But that morning, after the terrible trip home, from the first moment we got finished saying grace, I was beginning to plan things I had to do, which things had to be done first, and the best way to get them done. It was funny. It didn't even cross my mind or stall or try to get out of the work. I didn't wait for Mother to tell me what to do. I brought the subject up myself. I got to get the wagon unloaded right away, I told her. Everything will get damp sitting out there in the barn. Maybe I can get Jerry Sanford to help me roll the barrels down. Mother nodded. I think she must have been surprised to hear me talk like that, but she didn't let on. You'll need somebody bigger than Jerry. Perhaps you could hire Sam Smith's Negro, Ned. We discussed it all, and about halfway through breakfast I began to realize that I had changed. I wasn't acting like my usual self. I was acting more like a grown-up. You couldn't say that I was really much of an adult, but I wasn't a child anymore, that was certain. I thought about showing off in front of Sam when he'd come home. I'd say things like, well, Sam, we've decided not to put the oats in this year. We're going to use the space for corn. Or, we're not keeping the kitchen fire going all the time. We haven't got enough time for wood cutting as it is. I would be the one who knew about things, not him. But even though it was nice to feel more grown up and act that way too, I missed Father, especially towards the end of the day when I was tired and cold and hungry and there was still no wood to be brought up, and the barn needed to be cleaned and old Prue needed to be milked. I'd begin feeling sorry for myself and wishing that Father was back. I'd imagine that if I looked up, I'd suddenly see him striding into the barnyard, and I'd look up, but he wouldn't be there. I'd stand and feeling disappointed, even though I'd really known he wouldn't be there, and I'd let myself get angry with the rebels for starting this war, and angry with Sam for going to play soldier, and have the glory while I had to do all the work at home. It wasn't fair. It would make me curse, and I didn't care whether cursing was a sin. Winter came and winter went, and the war went on in the same distant way. Oh, the effects of it were real. The rising prices, the shortages of everything, the news that so-and-so had been killed in some faraway battle. But all the things that you think of as belonging to a war, the battles and the cannons and the firing and the marching troops and the dead and the wounded, we hadn't seen any of it, except for the messengers and the commissary officers who came by. It got to be spring of 1777. The work went on, except that instead of cutting wood, cleaning the barn, and pitching hay for the animals, I now spent my day digging and planting in our kitchen garden by the side of the house, so we'd have fresh vegetables for the tavern. I was doing this one Saturday morning, early towards the end of April, the 26th to be exact, when I began hearing from a long way away a heavy muttering noise. It sounded a bit like thunder, but not exactly. It made me uneasy. I jammed the spade in the ground and went out front of the tavern to have a look up and down the road, The sound seemed to be coming from the southwest, over behind the church somewhere, but there wasn't anything to be seen. And then I saw Ned, Sam Smith's negro, come running up the road. At that same moment, Captain Betts popped up out his house next door. Captain Betts was in the rebel militia. "What is it, Ned?" he shouted. "British troops, Captain," Ned shouted. He ran by. Captain Betts turned back in the doorway. "Jerry," he shouted, "quick, get Mr. Rogers here." Jerry Stamford dashed past him through the doors and up the road towards the Rogers. Captain Betts continued to stand there for a moment, listening. "What do you think they're doing, Captain Betts?" I called. He looked grim. "It won't be anything good. There are a lot of them." "Is the militia going to try to stop them?" He scowled. "There aren't enough patriots in Reading to stop a pair of cows from going through." Then he went back into the house. I turned and went into the tavern. Mother was scoring some pots. "British troops are coming," I told her. "What do you think that they'll do?" "Drink and not pay for it," she said. "That's the rule with the soldiers. Take the good pewter out of the barn and hide it in the hay." I did, and then I ran back around to the front to watch the soldiers come, and now I could see a fine shading of dust in the air, and out behind the church, rising slowly and drifting away. The noise grew louder. I watched, and all at once they came through the hedgerows, and I caught a glimpse of every movement and things flashing. In a moment the vanguard appeared, and around the bend there was a drummer boy banging away in the front, and a standard bearer, and then a couple of officers on horseback, and then the marching men. On down the road toward me they came. It was a frightening thing to see. They just kept coming on and on, as if nothing in the world could stop them. Now I could see cannons, each of them about 12 feet long, and drawn by 2 horses. I figured they must be 6-pounders, from what I had read about it. Behind them were wagons full of boxes and bags and powder with balls and such, I figured. The dust rose up through everything, turning the red uniforms, the cannons, the wagons, and all a grayish brown. They marched past the tavern, pulled off onto the training ground, and broke formation. Mr. Rogers ran by, with Jerry Stamford coming behind him as fast as he could. They dashed into Captain Betts' house. I hoped they weren't trying to get a train band organized to fight the British. That was impossible. There were hundreds of redcoats milling around on the training ground, maybe thousands even. Most of the people in the village were standing in their yards, watching. The children kept dashing up the road to the training ground to get a closer look, until their mothers saw them and dragged them back home again. In the training ground, the soldiers were settling down to eat breakfast, dumping their packs onto the ground and stacking their muskets into neat little teepees, 4 or 5 together. I kept hoping that some officers would come into the tavern for rum or beer or something to eat. I wanted to see them up close and listen to them talk. Oh, those troops were impressive looking, with all of those belts and buckles and powdered and horn and bayonets and so forth dangling about their red uniforms. How could people like Sam expect to beat them? But the officers didn't come into the tavern. Instead, 3 or 4 of them rode up to Mr. Heron's house, and I saw Mr. Heron open the door and let them in, and they disappeared. I guess that Mr. Heron had known in advance that they were coming. Probably he sent out a big breakfast for them. It gave me a funny feeling to realize that Mr. Heron was giving the British officers rum and beef. Captain Betts and Mr. Rogers were sitting in the Betts house 100 yards away, trying to figure out a way to kill them. I went on watching. Some of the bigger children had gotten away from their mothers and were standing at the edge of the training grounds looking at the soldiers. After a while, the children began shouting questions at the men like had they ever killed anybody, and weren't they afraid of the rebels, and so forth. The soldiers joked back with the kids, and after a while I walked over myself and listened. "Where are you headed for?" I asked one of the redcoats. "If I knew, I wouldn't tell yer." He had a funny accent. "Where are you from?" I asked. "Where are you from, lad?" "Right here," I pointed to the tavern. "Well, I'm from Old Dublin," he said, "and I wish I was back there right now, instead of marching through this blooming place." "What's Ireland like?" "Oh, 'tis lovely place, all green and cool like, if you don't mind a spot of rain. How is it you're not afraid of us, you tykes?" "We're mostly Tories here." Suddenly I realized that I was. Father's capture had done that. "Ah," he said, and I would have talked with him some more, but that just then an officer came riding around. "Get along, you bloody Yankee scum! Get back to your mothers!" He slapped his quirt on his leg, and we all ran. I stood in our yard watching. The officer shouted something to the soldiers. There was a scurrying around, and then 8 of them snatched up their guns, formed into 2 rows, and marched out behind the officer. He wheeled his horse about and trotted towards me. I jumped back and plunged for the tavern door. He galloped across our yard into the Betts' yard and pulled the horse up, and shouted some orders. The soldiers charged for the Betts' door, bashed it open and with the butt ends of their rifles, and slammed into the house. 5 minutes later they came out again, pushing in front of them Captain Betts, Mr. Rogers, and Jerry Stanford. Jerry was dead white. He was trying not to cry, but tears were squeezing out of his eyes, and he kept wiping his face with his sleeve. The soldiers pushed all 3 of them out into the road, tied their hands behind their backs, and marched them to the training ground through the troops. I knew now what the officers had gone up to Mr. Huron's front door for. It wasn't for breakfast. It was to find out who the rebel leaders were. Now my mother was standing in the doorway beside me. "Those are the brutes," she said. "What do they want with the little one? Can they think he's dangerous? What are they going to do with him, Mother?" "God have mercy on them," she said. "God have mercy on William Huron. They wouldn't shoot Jerry, would they? War turns men into beasts. It's cheaper to shoot a boy than feed him." "I don't think they would, Mother. I don't think they'd shoot Jerry. It seems unbelievable, but it made me go all cold all the same." She shrugged. "Maybe not. Only the Lord knows about that. Come into the house before they take fancy to you. Who knows what Mr. Huron's told them about your brother?" "I'm all right, Mother. Come into the house, Timothy. I've lost 2. I'm not losing another." I went in. I was full of all kinds of funny feelings. At first, when the troops had arrived, swaggering around so bold and gay, I had really admired them, but seeing them take Jerry Sanford off like that gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. I didn't think they'd shoot him. I figured they'd taken him away just because he lived with Captain Betts and happened to be there when the soldiers had come. But still, maybe they would shoot him. Maybe they'd want to torture him for secrets or something. After all, he had lived with one of the rebel leaders and might know of what their plans were, or whether they had ammunition stored someplace. I stood at the window watching. Mother told me to get away from the window and go out about my work, but I don't. I stayed there. Finally, about an hour and a half later, the officers mounted their horses and began riding through the troops, shouting orders. Within a couple of minutes, the soldiers were formed up in the training ground, ready to march. And just as they were about to start off, there came a sound of a horse galloping. I dashed outside in time to see a horseman come over the rise of the road in the direction from Danbury. He was dressed in ordinary clothes, and I guessed that he was a rebel messenger. Suddenly, he spotted the British troops formed up on the training ground. He reined up and wheeled the horse around. Bending low, he kicked his heels into the horse and started to tear off back the way he had come. There was a commotion in the British ranks and a quick fusillade of shots. The man suddenly straightened up in his saddle and flung his arms out. His head jerked backwards, and he slid off the back of the horse and laid still in the dusty road. The British officers shouted, and the troops marched. The rider's horse was cantering off in a field, bucking. The troops marched past the body. None of them turned to look at him. Finally, the last of the wagons disappeared beyond the bend, and I started running down the road towards the body, scared of what I might see. Other people came running too. The man was lying on his stomach, and his face turned sideways. There was a tear in his shirt in the center of his back, and blood was soaking through the cloth, but sweat was running off his pale face, and he was still breathing hard. "Pick him up and carry him to the tavern," Mr. Reed said. "Meeker, go up to the Dr. Hobart's house, and tell him we've got a wounded man down here." It was over 2 miles up to Dr. Hobart's. For a moment I thought about saddling up a horse, but the British troops were marching ahead of me in the direction of Mr. Hobart's, and I was afraid that if I came galloping up on a horse, they'd take me for a messenger and shoot me too. On foot, I could cut through the fields if I had to. I began running. Within 5 minutes I ran into a dusty haze kicked up by the troops and realized that I must They must be just ahead of me. I jumped to the side of the road, swung over the stone wall, and cut across the pasture to the next stone wall, which was bordered by a line of trees. I slid over the wall and began running along it, parallel to the road. I figured out I would run past the British troops and come out ahead of them before they reached Dr. Hobart's house. It would take some running, though. The British column was a mile long. I ran on, stumbling through the pasture, stumbling through the furrows of the plowed fields, and I had covered almost 2 miles when I heard shots. At first only one or two, but then a fusillade. I dropped back behind some stone wall, and then raised my head to stare around. I couldn't see anything but an empty field that lay between me and the road. I slid over the stone wall and began to run, crouched over towards the stone wall at the other side of the field, which bordered the road. When I got to the wall, I flung myself flat and listened. The shooting was going on down the road. I took a chance and raised my head to look over the wall. The British column was disappearing around the bend, but a couple dozen of the troops stayed behind. They were kneeling on the road in a line facing Captain Starr's house across the road from them, on the other side from where I lay. From where I was hidden behind the wall, I could look through the downstairs window on the side of the house. There were the rebels there, firing back at the redcoats. The way I figured it, the rebels had hidden there and begun shooting at the British troops as they marched by. Through the windows I could see the rebels moving around. I couldn't recognize all of them, but I knew some. One was Captain Starr, another was Samuel Smith's Negro slave Ned, the same one who'd first come running to report the British were coming. As I watched one of the British pitched over flat on the road, the rest went on firing into the building, as if the bullets coming out of them didn't matter. It was the way the British fought. Suddenly an officer shouted an order. The British troops rose, their bayonets flashing at the ends of their muskets. The officer raised his sword and charged towards the house. The troops ran after him. When they reached the door, the officer stood aside while the soldiers battered the door with their muskets. Suddenly it crashed open, and the troops charged in. I heard somebody shout, There are some damned blacks in here. What shall we do with them?" "Kill them!" the officer yelled. He charged through the door, waving his sword. I could see Ned swivel away from the window where he crouched, attempting to swing his rifle around to get in a shot at the officer, but the officer was quicker. He slid a sword into Ned's stomach and then jerked it free. Ned staggered around, still raising his gun up for the shot. The sword flashed in a bright arc, the fastest thing I had ever saw move. Ned's head jumped off of his body and popped into the air. I never saw it fall. It dropped down behind the stone wall, and I vomited all over myself. Then I got up, ran across the field, and fell over this other stone wall. I lay there smelling my vomit and seeing Ned's head jumping up in the air. It was a long time before I realized that I was soaked with cold sweat and crying. I knelt up and listened. The shooting had stopped. I remembered the man in the tavern. He was dying too, and I didn't want to have his death laid on me. I slipped through the hedgerow, and when I was well past Mr. Starr's house, I came up the field and back onto the road. For a moment I looked. In the distance I could see the British troops milling around the house. They were carrying heavy objects into the house. I knew what they were, but I didn't want to think about it. When the British had all the things in the house, they set it on fire. I turned and ran down the road towards Dr. Hobart's. I didn't feel much like being a Tory anymore.